What was bad is that system in which somehow made him do something wrong.
The greatest risk isn't necessarily bad decisions. It's the decisions we never make.
We killed innovation so many times out of too many regulations for whatever the right reasons were in their head.
Where does that paralysis comes from in your experience? Is it fear? Is it ego? What happens to the culture of a company when companies kind of confuse protecting value with actually creating it? Welcome back to Mork Unfiltered, folks. In a world obsessed with doing more, we hear about this all the time, more of this, more of that, more earnings, more shares, more revenues. It's ironic that one of the biggest mistakes and one of the biggest risks that we face in today's companies is actually not doing enough. My guest today, Mary Francia, knows this better than most. She is a board director, strategist, and advisor to global companies, helping leaders navigate the tension between protecting the present and building the future. Over a career that spanned leadership roles at companies like Nokia and Philips, Mary has seen firsthand how great ideas and innovation can be derailed, if not completely crushed, not by incompetence, but actually by inaction and fear. In one of her recent articles, blew me away. This article, The Cost of Not Doing Nothing, really struck a chord with me, revealing how short-term thinking and defensive mindsets are quietly eroding innovation, trust, and long-term relevance across boardrooms absolutely all over the world. Today, we're going to be diving into the messy middle of corporate governance, the human side of leadership, the politics of power, and what happens when companies are too afraid to take the very risks that could save them. Mary, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Patrick. Loved having you.
It's great to have you here. Tell us a little bit more about your career and what got you so passionate and fired up about corporate governance specifically, just to get us started.
Thank you. Well, Mary Francia, I am speaking today from Florida. And as a summary, to give you a view, I try to define that I've been working about 25, 30 years leading global businesses across technologies and manufacturing, from Philips that you mentioned, to what is now Nokia, to before Flextronics, to before Time Warner, to before Air Liquide. My work has always been in trying to build new business, new channels, and working very close with the CEO on the board. Today, I serve on several boards and advisory groups focused on sustainability and governance. So to answer your question about what took me to governance, when you are at that level, when you're working close, and I've just been very lucky by accident. It really wasn't by a position that I applied. I just happened to meet the CEO of a company, I get hired and work very close at that level. So it gave me an opportunity to see things from that systemic view from very young and not any young anymore, but allowed me to see that. And it's like what I say, I think I wrote an article a year or so ago about, when you clean in a glass and you start seeing things, you cannot unsee it. So when you work at that level and you see all the systems and all the pieces, and you see what happens and what doesn't happen and what gets done and what doesn't get done, to the point that you were mentioning on the article, it kind of builds a passion on you. In a way, it does block you from sometimes working in very Zoom projects, because it's very hard not to see. It's like when you get a horse and you block them, it's very hard not to know, because what is the impact of what you're doing into other areas, but yet again, you don't have the control or the say in those other areas. So that is what drove me into governance. My work has always been on a strategy on building businesses in whatever that value creation meant from an action point of view in whatever industry it was on, is what drove me into being on that side where I was putting the presentations together for the board into wanting to get things approved, or telling the story of now wanting on the other side to help the business understand and help them navigate, because we have some messy waters nowadays globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for our audience, some of which, we have, business leaders, we have entrepreneurs, we have first-time entrepreneurs, we have people who are dreaming of becoming entrepreneurs. Can you give us kind of like a high-level summary on, what is corporate governance? What does a board of directors do, and why is corporate governance and a board important, right? Regardless of the size of the company, you've obviously done this at the highest levels. But even startups that are successfully funded eventually have to have a board of directors. So why is a board so important? What does it do? And why does this corporate governance stuff matter?
I was having this exchange just a couple of weeks ago with a fantastic writer that is writing a book about governance in South Africa. And as I was doing the endorsement, I had to read her book. And then read another one.
Yeah, kind of
But
have to read the book if you're going to endorse it. Yeah.
Well, it was the previous book before I could endorse the next one. So you kind of want to go when you went from one another. But what I came to is corporate governance in general is that system by which, a company is directed, is controlled, is held accountable. It defines who does what, how, and whom. The board's role is to ensure that there is that alignment between purpose, strategy, and performance and integrity. I was having a discussion yesterday about scandals and disruptions, and I think we all also have stories about what had gone wrong with some companies. And the point was that the company wasn't bad. The people there were not bad either. What was bad is that system in which somehow made them do something wrong. And that is what I'm referring that governance is no more than a compliance framework, you could say.
Yeah.
But it's that architecture of trust that you build in a company. And you need it from day one to make sure that you are one, if you're that CEO, because the role of the board is to help that CEO, maybe not to burn the wings when he or she is too close to that sun, but has to, because the competition is so hard, the business is so hard, the pressure is so hard, that you want to make sure that the company is within the guardrails of what we said we would be doing, and to have that asking the questions so that we can think again and sit again and say, what are we doing when it comes to strategy, when it comes to purpose? Because if something has to change, then we all need to agree on what is going to change. We can just let you go out there for a month and come back later on. That it would be the role of the board. I know it was a long one, but I was trying to give you the context.
What's a typical example of a decision where the board has to be involved?
Well, depending on the company, and that's a good question. So let me unpack that one. You could say that depending on the size of the company, the role of the board is a bit different. And that is what you look at when you're joining a board, whether it's a startup, it's a series of that, where they are going IPO, where they are all the way to a corporate board. But I think if you look at that, are opportunities when you decide to go into a new market where there's going to be an investment, whether it's on human capital, anything that might create risk, or when we're dealing with an opportunity of, from a strategy point, since I've been doing a strategy, always you say that if you want to go there, how do I need to do today so I can look like them, who is where you want to go? And that you normally build it, or you borrow it, or you buy it. And in those three spots, you will say that the board is part of, or should be part of, because I'm going to question if we say, oh, we're going to build it and we're going to put someone in there to go ahead and join it. The question from the board is, do we have time to do that? Or are we good enough to do that? Just to have an open-end discussion. Or if you're going to partner, is that aligned to what we say our values and principles are on what that partner is doing in these other three markets? So when it comes to the filtering, whether they pass the filter, is this the company that we can marry? Or we're going to buy the talent? A question would be whether we have the structure, and you coming from corporate would appreciate that, whether we have the structure to enable that human capital that is coming, not to kill, not to be killed. Because we've done that. And that could be expensive, right? So
it's like, I think the statistics on acquisitions going badly is something like 70% of acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions transactions fail, or something like that.
Yeah. So hopefully that gave you a view, but those would be the questions, the times when the board should be in.
Got it. And for a smaller company, right? Say a Series A or Series B startup, how does board's responsibilities in corporate governance change compared to like a larger Fortune 500?
Well, if you're looking at in the smaller ones, there will be two types of board. You have a fiduciary board and non-fiduciary board, and I'm referring to like an advisory board. So on an advisory board, whether it's one where you're coaching, advising, a bit more of a hands-on in a way, because you're having a chat about whether the CEO comes to you for advice. And we always say that you have to know how to cook to oversee the kitchen, right? So it's more of that experience that you bring to have you thought of that? Have you evaluated that? And more of a coach in a way. And I love it because it gives you an opportunity to really kind of have the right of conversation and engagement that in a typical fiduciary board you might not, because by then, we say nose in and hands out. It is more of the asking questions that working closer with the management. On a startup, sometimes you start on that advisory board, and then, as they get to thinking and they go to Series B and on all that, then the quality of your board members should be very different. Because besides that coaching and all that part that you had, now you're looking at compliance and you're looking at if you're going to go IPO. So I think I was mentioning last time in the session that you want to have the quality and the skill sets in that board that help you 18 months from now know what you need to get done now. So on a startup, and it could be the IPO, and it could be getting that board to put you in front of investors that you normally wouldn't have to. So it tends to be sometimes a little bit of that pedigree that you need in order to get you into the right rooms and in the right conversations.
And obviously from one company to another, depending on, your complexities, the size of the organization, the industry that they're in, I guess, board composition and responsibilities differs from one company to another. When you look at, for example, early stage companies or maybe later, a little bit medium-sized companies, growth companies, is there a best practice in terms of, on the one hand, the size of your board, kind of the optimal size so that it brings a lot of value, but also doesn't slow things down too much? And also, I think a follow-on question to that would be board composition, right? Ideally, and I know that the CEO doesn't control their board composition unless they own the company completely, but what advice would you give, people building a board for the first time? What kind of composition should they have in terms of the number of people and what kind of profiles they should have?
It's a good question, and it could go in different angles, and it has to do with industry many times. It has to do also with the comfort level that the CEO wants to have, where they play, and that's what I meant about the industry. So the context could vary. So you could say, for example, that a seed to Series B to Series A to start. It could have about 3 to 5 members, and that is usually your founder and your CEO, and sometimes it's 1 or 2 investors, and one ideally or 2 independent directors. And that is the independent directors, because then they are going to be giving you a bit more of a reality check versus what the investors want to raise. And it kind of helps you validate, not the easiest position to be, but you want to have someone that is good for that than just a friend. And then you go to a Series B to a pre-IPO kind of thing.
Right.
Now you're looking at expanding a bit more. So you're going like 5 to 7 members. And usually they are more independent directors then, because they give you that strategic, financial and governance background. And then when I was talking about depending on also the independence that the CEO wants to have, because sometimes, like on everything in life, Patrick, and in every company, politics do get in the way.
Absolutely.
So that from an experienced director that has objectivity and credibility, it can come into a room. Probably by then she didn't accept it, and that's when I go. I mean, there's many people that are very interested in getting on board, so and don't do the right, review per se, and you go in a room where it's very hard to control the CEO. Doesn't want to be controlled. So it's better not to walk into.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I can see the angle from both sides. I work a lot with CEOs. I work a lot with startup founders, and sometimes the board stories are great. More often than not, they're not. What can a startup CEO do to maximize the chance that they have the right board for themselves? And obviously, I know that they can't make all the decisions, but assume, like, so for example, I just got investment, from a venture capital fund. The venture capital fund is probably going to assign a partner to me. How can I maximize the chance of getting the right person on my board?
That's a good question, but let's put it in a couple layers instead. What should that CEO need to see on a board? How does the CEO need to see the value of the board?
Right.
Because that is a very first hard to, because they don't want to be controlled. Are they going to be a block? Are they going to be not allowing me to do things? So the board should not be a formality or a hurdle. It should be an asset. So to your point about there's been some boards may not have been that high performance, because the idea is to expand the line of sight of that CEO, challenge the assumptions, provide the kind of perspective that will help sharpen the decision, to make an informed decision. And sometimes if you have the right board, then they will just don't just approve the strategy, but they're going to pressure test the strategy. And I think the CEO, to answer that first layer, would be that the CEO needs to find a way to see that value. Because if that value is not seen, then why make a board?
Good point.
And when you're looking at if the board then is set up to help the CEO, then I need to make sure on the other side that I'm helping that person see beyond the short term, to start looking at things, like I was describing before, systematically. I call it systemic intelligence, but I think I just came up with that last week. But also you want to keep them accountable.
Right.
And that's the hard part. And you want to also help them evolve and grow, which is funny because I get that a lot. But they got to grow as a person. They got to, we're all humans at the end of the day.
Right.
So you want to make sure that the board has the ability to help that person grow, not just be a checker.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's one of the fears that I have is so often, particularly in the work that I've done in Latin America, I find that the boards, especially with startups, but I coached a woman who, was a Harvard MBA, was running a $300 million retail operation and had a board that was micromanaging her. I mean, they would literally go through the P&L with like a fine tooth comb, looking at, item by item and asking, investment questions and really getting into the details. And sometimes, I wonder how good that is, right? And how much detail should the board get into when it comes to decision making, which on the one hand, I know that obviously the responsibility of the board is to protect the shareholders. There is an element of keeping the CEO and management in check, but what's your experience in terms of how much detail should they get into? What's responsible versus what becomes micromanagement?
Well, we're going into leadership for that,
right.
because now you're looking at the type of board member that you have in that room to begin with. What I have seen, let me tell you what I have seen as I answer that. The board, whether small or large, could make the mistake of being complacent when the market is super nice and everything is going fine and the CEO is just rolling in and the numbers are going, and not to ask questions at that time because everything is fine. And that's very dangerous place to be in. And then they go into audit mode when the market is not doing well, to point about fact checking every number in there and questioning everything. And I've seen scary things where actually they have brought a third party to come in and do it. So when you lose the trust on that CEO, or when you don't have the trust of that CEO, you may be, projecting that if you go in that mode. The agenda of the board meeting should not be 90%, 80% of it in checking numbers and doing that. I mean, I send you the details before you look at them, you read them, and hopefully you understood all of that. It should be on the strategy side. It would be on the how to create value and how the business is going. It would be a great opportunity for that CEO to get advice rather than answering questions like on a test.
Exactly.
So I think that balance comes having the right people in the room, having a level of experience in the room, and also having that board being one that not just checks, but also challenges. When I was talking about a strategy and pressure test, is bringing that innovation and keeping that. Of course, the meeting should never be a walk in the park. That's clear.
Of course.
But I don't support having 80% of that fact checking, and also having half of the other part voting on 20 things that should have been done. So I think it has a lot to do with whomever is at the board. How do they work in working the agenda? Because that's what happens all before the board meeting. And if you can work that well, you should minimize that.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say there is, preparing your board meetings properly, making sure that you're sending out, a deck that's really comprehensive, that addresses most of the agenda items on the board's mind, making sure that the information is properly prepared. That stuff probably goes a long way to having, not easy board meetings, but at least relatively smooth ones.
It is. And of course, we don't want window dressing either.
Sure.
But we do want to have the opportunity. And then board meeting doesn't just happen out of the blue. You have been talking before in preparation for that agenda. And sometimes they have small committees that they get together to talk on a subject before that. So a board is for approval, not for huge discussions. And I always say that, to your point about the preparation, remember that you're coming in as a board, and I think you've lived in Latin America for a bit, Patrick, so you would understand novelas. The concept of novelas.
Some of the board meetings I've been in feel like a novella. So,
But I meant to you're coming in and you're walking in and you're watching one episode.
Exactly.
But you don't know what happened 3 episodes before, 20 or 150 episodes before, the way they are going.
Right.
So your role is to make sure that you can provide the right information so that I can understand what's going on in that episode. But two, it's also the role of the board to go and do homework and find out and learn so that you know who is the person showing up in that episode. So you're just watching a window because that is what the board meeting is.
So there's also a responsibility on the CEO and the management team to make sure that the board is prepared, has done their homework, has read the material beforehand, comes with intelligent questions, challenges, is proactive as opposed to you just get up, you look at the slides, once a quarter and then ask 2-3 questions and that's it, right? So I guess it kind of goes both ways.
It does. I think you're going to be questioning the effectiveness of the board member. On one side, you could also question the effectiveness of the CEO and the management team in presenting what needs to be presented. So I agree, they could go both ways.
In one of your recent posts, you said something to the effect of, the greatest risk isn't necessarily bad decisions, it's the decisions we never make. And I wanted to expand a little bit on that because that seemed to be kind of at the heart of your article. Can you share with us and share with the audience maybe a time that you saw firsthand where the lack of action at the board level really cost the company its future?
Well, I have worked very closely with CEOs and the board in all of my companies, so I couldn't really share an example of any of them because I would make him lose face. So what I could tell you is that I was talking about the power of not doing pretty much on that one, because we have seen all as corporate, as we work in different roles, where there were opportunities to do something that in our view, as executives at the time, was a fantastic opportunity to get into a market or to do it. And somehow, for reasons that sometimes we didn't get to see 3 levels higher or 4 levels side, talking about systemics, the decisions were not done. So when I was doing a strategy, for example, for one of them, I would present, option 1, 2, 3, 4 of what we wanted to do. And option 1 was not do anything. But what I did is I would unpack the impact that we would have in not doing things so that we could, if that is the decision that we have to make, because sometimes that is what you have to make for things that you might not understand from an executive level, then you understand what is the risk that we just created and how do we de-risk it. And it could mean we need to sell that business because if we don't do this, 2 years from now, a year from now, the competition is doing it. And that means our business is out. So the cost of not doing, unfortunately, sometimes go completely flat, meaning it was not done, period. And it was not de-risk, period. So you will see many cases out there of things that just never made it to the market, or software and applications that didn't get integrated on our own products because they made the decision based on short-term gains of using something out of China, out of a different vendor. And those are examples that I think you and I can relate to on the corporate side of the cost of not doing what should have been done that would have built value in a company. And as board members, looking at it years later from the other side, my question would be on the board, we need to make sure that we can ensure that the blocks, the hurdles that could have made decisions like that are not in the boards that we're in, are not in the companies that we're in. We killed innovation so many times out of too many regulations for whatever the right reasons were in their head. And I question if they were right. And I think you question them too.
Where does that paralysis comes from in your experience? I mean, is it fear? Is it ego? Is it incentives and the way they're structured? Is it a mixture? Where does that paralysis come from?
Well, you could say that, in my view, which might not be the right one, is that on one side, leaders don't like change. And sometimes the risk that change creates does not fit with what they're being, I don't want to say the word paid for, but it is what counts on their bonus at the end of the year. And if that is
part
not
of it is in the
building,
incentive structure.
if it isn't on that architecture, then you're just going to bypass that. So, and unfortunately, sometimes we have allowed the culture of a company to be one where everybody's for their own meat
Mm-hmm.
and not for the higher good of the company. I remember when my boss, and I worked for Ben Bervayan at Alcatel-Lucent, as the year that I joined and he joined, he forfeit his bonus. He says, I'm not taking a bonus. We didn't do well. I mean, we had gone from a 20 billion company in 2008 when the merge was going and all that fun to when I joined, it was a 14 billion company.
Oh.
So we were not doing well. We had not done well. So why should we take a bonus? Which was no fun, I had just joined. But anyway, the point is, he was trying to set up a culture that sometimes is not the culture that is or exists today. Hopefully that gives you the perspective.
Yeah, that gives me some perspective. I mean, when I was looking at your background, I couldn't help but notice that you spent a couple of years at Nokia. And I think, Nokia is one of those companies. I remember when I started to get into tech, when, in 2000, Nokia was the 800-pound gorilla, right? They were the market leader in phones. They had like 80 or 90% share of the phone market. I worked with them in mobile games, selling them games, getting games pre-installed on their devices. I remember I had Nokia phones forever. How does that kind of like defensive mindset take hold of a boardroom before, like, how can you tell that mindset is starting to take over in a company culture before it becomes a problem?
Well, just to go back a bit on your point, I worked for Alcatel-Lucent, who became Nokia after.
Right. Okay.
Nokia was a very good partner for us, but Alcatel had just joined with Lucent. And for those that are Americans, North Americans, and knew Lucent, this was the telco.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that company.
And Alcatel was the telco in France.
Yep.
So we had a merge of giants, is what they used to say. And I came precisely at that time. I came to kind of help on that. And the work that I did was to review all the strategies that we had across. But the mindset at that time, I don't think I had enough information when I was there to understand the mindset of the board. We had a new board, and many of them, we had a great chair. We had a fantastic CEO in my view, but I was very biased, right? Because he brought me on. But we still were trying to survive on a 20 billion structure, on a 14 billion income, on things that we needed to do that for some reason one or the other didn't do, to the point of that article that cost us. I mean, it cost us a whole behind in a lot of technology. So how do you get all of those things to kind of wrap up, and how do you get the team involved, and how do you get the leadership, especially in a company that has got a crash of cultures, because les Américains et les French.
Of course.
Here we're coming in, and Lucent thought that they had been the big hype, and I'm not going to go there because I don't want to question anyone. But I was coming in to kind of to align what we had. So I think it is something that is culturally injected into every one of them, and it was coming from both sides. In my view, the board of Lucent had been very complacent, and they left, of course, when that came, because there were a lot of things that were absolutely missed. But then I'm thinking that maybe in those years, and if you look at the stories, sadly, the ones that we have heard of Exxon and things like that, that showed us the horrible examples of what you could do to kill a company, maybe that was the culture at that time. So I wasn't playing at that time, so I cannot criticize them.
Yeah.
But I could criticize them today if they were the board of what the things that they should be asking, that they should be doing. And the mindset of, I think what I call was that collective agility to embrace change as a collective board, to teach each other, to question, and to embrace the things that needed to be done. And I'm referring to technology changes and cyber attacks and AI and all the things that are coming. I think to answer your question in the short side, it was just the culture that came in, sadly, didn't help.
How does that actually feel when you're in a boardroom like that and you know that a certain decision needs to be made and nobody moves? What's the feeling? What's the emotion that goes through a person when you're sitting in a board and you see this, or you see a lack of action and action is sorely needed?
I think that's more of a question for the CEO that was on that side, which is the one that needed the support of something that needed to get done. And sometimes out of risk, whichever was the question, I don't think that if I was the CEO, I would feel very empowered on one side. I would probably question whether I'm going to stay. And you probably have seen that the CEOs are not lasting as much as they were before. We see a lot of shorter terms, at least in the last years in the US. So I think that if I would probably just be disappointed on that. And how do you pressure?
Right.
So I remember when I joined one of the firms, my role was mainly to kind of help everybody bring the best out of the knowledge that they had. And
Yeah.
there's, I will tell you, in every board, executive board or boards in every board, there is just fantastic knowledge around. You know, some people might question the age or how many years a board member is there, or the young ones that are coming in with all their hype and tech. I think everybody has the great intention of creating value. You just have to help them unpack it and see it. And we may not have done a good job in doing that in the past. And we have replaced the board with people that may not necessarily bring value. I was in a session where I heard someone, and sometimes you kind of question, how did that person get there? That's what I mentioned earlier, that sometimes it's a bit political. But yeah, I can imagine, to answer your question, if decision is not getting done, I just wouldn't be a happy camper.
What can the leadership do to change that? What can leaders do to build a culture in a company where the board members are there based on their ability to have an impact, drive the culture, help the company innovate, challenge management, and not end up being like, an elderly kind of like white guys gentlemen's club where nothing really gets done and people are there because they're friends? What can management do to build a culture where they have the right kind of board members?
That's a question that I don't know that we can solve right now, but what I always say is that the board needs to find a way to talk to management and to see management. And that is when the CEO succession plan works out well, because you have an opportunity to invite management to do presentations of different subjects. So what management can do from that angle is educate the board, let them see their perspective, and that will be super helpful on that angle. So that's a step one on that view. And then so it will help the narrative of the CEO on what is trying to be conveyed. And it will let them see who could be the next CEO, or whether we don't have one and we should be looking for one. But most importantly is get that board to see it with their eyes. And on the other side, I think I always promote the ability of a C-level executive to get on a board themselves, because they would help them understand how the board is dealing with things as they're presenting to their own board. And it will also help them understand how to be more effective into communicating with the board and helping them see what they need to approve.
Okay. I want to go a little bit to kind of, instances a little bit more where, governance has not worked out the way it should, right? And, I think, in that last post, you were talking about, some boards are making, they're mistaking survival for resilience, right? They're saying, well, we've got to, stick to the business that we know. This is kind of like, it's a very profitable, defensible business. We have a moat there, right? And so there's a lot of focus on survival as opposed to innovation because of the risk that entails. When I was at a company called Glue Mobile, and this is exactly what happened. The company went public in 2007. We were a very successful mobile gaming company back in the pre-iPhone, pre-Android days. We had built a business that was very defensible, selling mobile games to mobile operators. And that was a very defensible business because it was hard to build a relationship with Telefonica or Verizon or these big companies. And then all of a sudden the App Store comes out and everything changes. And the board refused to really give us the budget and the manpower to develop games for iPhone and Android. And by the time we got around to it, the market had completely moved on, right? So what happens to the culture of a company when companies kind of confuse protecting value with actually creating it?
Thanks, Patrick. And you're sharing an example that is very specific to you on that, and you have seen the failure of it.
Yeah, I was there. I lived it. I mean, it was the most horrible thing in the world to be on those calls and realizing where the market was going and realizing that the US board and management team just were too afraid to go there. And a number of us ended up leaving the company, and the company completely tanked afterwards. I mean, it was a shadow of itself a year later. They ended up shutting down the studios in Europe. All the top management in Europe left. The two founders of the European business, Mary, actually left the company, started another video games company that was sold to Electronic Arts for $400 million, which was more than the value of the company that they left that was public. 2 years before.
Well, sorry that you had to live that, first of all.
Oh, it was a great experience. I learned a lot.
Well, on my side, like I mentioned before, I never speak of the companies I work with or clients
Right.
because that's not integrity, that's gossip. But after years inside and alongside global boards, I have seen the patterns that repeat
Right.
when governance quietly doesn't really go. And I think you were referring to the article and I was referring to the fact that it starts with that silence. When the
Right.
board stops asking the uncomfortable questions, remember I always told you that they go complacent on some areas and then they go all the way out. And that middle part, somehow, where did that go? How
Yeah.
did we go from fantastic to crap
Right.
when we were presenting? Where were you when I needed the help to continue the line and helping it? So I think I've seen boards that maybe get distracted by whatever compliance was the flavor of the month and they miss the real issue. I always say that the culture, the trust, the tone, what has been paying the checks. And you remember the stories of Nortel in the past, for example,
Sure.
how things crashed there as well. And your question, where was the board? What were they protecting at the time? But your question was on the culture, what happens to the culture of a company when that governance fails. I have seen, like you mentioned, as well as an example, cases where the people that were not approved to do something depart the company and start somewhere else. And they start with that patent that we were trying to protect and we're allowed to take because, worst case, we were not doing anything with it, whichever were the terms, I don't know. And they start something great. And I go, good for them. Because for me, I just hate to see something killed when a technology development comes on or whichever. But with the company becomes very reactive and instead of being intentional when the board becomes like that, and that goes all the way down because the decisions go what I would call, I think the word would be from principle to convenience.
Right. Sure.
That would be a way to describe it because then you will see that cascades everywhere across the company and it's very hard to regain from that. And
so sorry, go.
Sorry, what is being allowed becomes culture.
Right. So what I'm taking away from what you're saying there is the actions or inactions of the board have a ripple effect that ripples across the entire company from the top of the organization all the way down and can have a major impact on the company's culture.
Yeah.
It's that significant.
And also, Patrick, also remember, I'm not trying to defend the board, but the board sees what is presented.
Right.
And that is where I was talking about the article that I wrote that you were referring to as we started the call today was sometimes the board doesn't even see it. They don't know because the CEO did not present it. So the culture is being able to ask the questions so that we can unveil the things that maybe are there behind. And that who do you blame becomes a question because if the board didn't know, you could say that their role was to know.
Right.
But then, we can go in a whole other angle when we're talking about what gets presented and what doesn't get presented. So I don't know that I want to blame the board for everything. You know what? I'm just trying to give you that context.
No, I appreciate that. I think, for the last part of the podcast, I think maybe switching gears a bit, I want to kind of switch to how we fix the problem, right? Because undoubtedly, this is a lot of the work that you do. You advise CEOs, you advise boards, you see what's worked, you see what hasn't worked. How do we go about changing this? I mean, take the example for what you just mentioned, right? The situation where a board doesn't have enough information or where a board depends on, the slides in the board deck that they get from management. What do good board members do to make sure that they're properly informed and have as much information as they need to make the right decisions or ask the right questions?
Well, I was just at a conference last week and that was a lot. That was a whole session we were talking about asking the right questions. And I was giving an example of one that we were doing before of asking the whole idea of the board. One is not to make you lose face, right? I'm not here to make you look bad. I'm not make you ignorant. I'm helping you to see things from a perspective that I gained because of what I did before. And that is, we've seen the movie kind of thing a few times. And so we want to make sure that you have not seen the movie. So let me tell you what happened in that movie and why I'm asking you the questions. It's that respect that we have in asking why am I helping you? And hopefully when I was talking about collective agility, I was referring to everybody on the board, let them see what you see that they may not be seeing and why you're raising the point. So I think clarifying the purpose and the role of the board is important as you walk in the room. Like, why are we here for? And sometimes we don't do that question coming in and becomes an audit check, like the one that you were referring to on your experience on a client. So defining the value that we bring, defining, what are we doing our duty very clearly and what are we here for? It's good to have the mindset in the right room, in the right space when you're walking in. Yeah. The role of the board is to assess whether the company, the board itself has the skills and the experience to do it. And that is when I do the board assessments and the board compositions evaluations, because are we good enough to where we are? And do we need to add skills to the board? And that could be either by training or by replacing board members or adding seats, whichever. But I think it's important on one side that you do the self-check about whether we're good enough. And that is to your point about elevating the board effectiveness on that. Because if you have the right people in the room, the skill sets regarding industry and finance and all of those things that we say, the taxonomy of the skill sets for the boardroom, those, I was just writing that those are table stakes.
Yeah.
That is not something that I need to worry about. That's what you should have to get in the room.
Yeah, exactly.
It is your ability to do that and to elevate, to amplify what gets you to stay in the room and to get you to make that board level better. But shifting, being able to have that agility is important. And be curious. You want somebody that is walking in the room ready to ask the question so that you can improve the quality of the information. And if they don't have it, to let them see why that would be helpful and then come back with it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, look, that's super helpful. Listen, as we kind of look to wind down a little bit the episode, at the end of our podcast, we always do kind of our signature kind of lightning round of questions, which are the same questions I ask every person on this podcast. They're fun and quirky, so these are questions to have fun. They're not super intense or dense like some of the other questions we went through earlier.
Okay.
So to go into the lightning round of questions, the first question I have for you is, what's one superpower that you wish you had?
I think about me, the superpower that I wish I had better is what before we used to call it a street smart, which I call it that systemic intelligence, is the ability to grow and see things wider, better, always.
Okay. All right. If you could have dinner with one historical figure, alive or dead, who would it be?
I'm always been curious about Giscard, to understand what was the life then, because there were so many things that were decided for Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those were very different days. Different days. And last but not least, if there was one failure that taught you a very powerful life lesson, whether personal or professional, that you're willing to share, what was it and what did you learn?
I like that part, that you're willing to share.
I always say that.
I know, it's fine. But I think it would be to look a bit more for myself. And I always say when I coach someone that no one is going to look more for you than you, not the company, not anyone. So is to make sure that sometimes you put yourself below something to help. Don't do that.
Look out for yourself. And I think a lot of people will relate to that point. I think a lot of us have been guilty of doing that, especially those of us who coach others as part of our work.
I know, we tell him to do it, and I don't mean it to be selfish.
Yeah.
We are here to lift others. We are here to help others.
Yeah.
Just don't sacrifice yourself for helping someone. Yeah. Sometimes it's something that I've done, and I don't regret, but I wish that it would have been a little less on that one.
Yeah. Well, listen, Mary, this has been a really interesting and rich conversation. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights and answering the questions and helping to pull back a little bit the curtain on what really goes on behind boardrooms and what boards do and what corporate governance is all about. Before we sign off, is if people want to learn more about you, about your work, how do you suggest people find you and connect with you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. I think that is where the easiest place that we can, you'll find us Mary Francia. I'm happy to connect with the network. Okay. And excited. And this was great. I didn't know where the conversation was going to go, honestly. It was interesting that we went into board. I thought we were going to just go into leadership. But that is what leadership is as well.
Yeah. And look, I want to leave the door open for another conversation on leadership because that's one of my favorite topics. And we could spend hours on that one as well. So,
okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Mork Unfiltered. And for those of you turning in, I hope this was something insightful and new and different for you. I hope you got a lot out of it. Please leave any comments or any questions that you have for us in the places where you listen to your podcasts. Success always is not about playing it safe. It's about trying things new that are new and stepping out of our comfort zones and learning from others. And it's about having the courage to ask difficult and powerful questions, even when they make us super uncomfortable. I'm Patrick Mork. This has been another episode of Mork Unfiltered. Make sure that you subscribe, like, and share to this podcast, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you so much for being here today.